Meanwhile, the bombshell statement last week in the South African Parliament by President Cyril Ramaphosa condemning the United States-led North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, for the conflict in Ukraine must have come as a shocker to the West. In his speech to the lawmakers, President Ramaphosa stated categorically that he would not bow to pressure to condemn Russia for, in his words, its special military operation. The South African leader declared that the war could have been avoided if NATO had heeded the warnings from amongst its own leaders and officials over the years that its eastward expansion will lead to greater, not less, instability in the region. For the significance of this position by the South African president and for whether it's a view that can easily find acceptance among other African countries, we're now being joined by Farai Muvuti, senior analyst at the Southern African Times. Thanks so much for joining us on Newsday. First of all, I'd like to know your take on the South African president's position on the Russian-Ukraine crisis.
Thank you for having me. And I think that, of course, the position somewhat comes as a surprise, considering that South Africa has always retained quite good relations with the West. It is constantly it's part of the G20 summit. It is part of the global infrastructure, and as far as investment is concerned. So there was no suspicion that that would be the case. But well, that is only for those that are who come from the West. But for those of us in Africa, especially those aware of the global politics or geopolitical framework within Southern Africa itself, would know that Russia and the Southern African region have a deep history tied through its decolonial project and its assistance to the liberation movements within that part of the world. So the statements of Ramaphosa come as no surprise. If anything, what he tried to do is to give a historical context as to not be caught up in the global, or rather, if one is to call the West the world, which of course it is a minority by virtue of population, considering the global South. But if we are to use the popular term, the world, as it were, the world community, why he differed here is because he felt that there was no cool-headed approach to trying to engage the issue between Russia and Ukraine, especially within the context of the history that impacts and generates the kind of outcome that we currently see. So he wanted to give a full-rounded, contextual-based approach and arguing equally that if one is to condemn, it denies them the ability to facilitate a mutual arrangement that will lead to peace.
And this definitely comes as somewhat of a surprise to the U.S. I want to read a quote from one of the generals from Uganda who also shares in the South African president's sentiments. He says, when USSR parked nuclear-armed missiles in Cuba back in 1962, the West was ready to blow up the world over it. Now, when NATO does the same, they expect Russia to do differently. These kinds of comments, do you not think would put these African countries in direct loggerheads with the West, who feel completely differently?
Well, only if Africa speaks with one voice. The problem that we have, of course, is that even if you look at the UN voting, it was 50-50. 25 countries abstained, and the rest of the 24 voted in favor of the notion. And that's what's problematic. Africa is not yet speaking with one voice, yet our history is intertwined. So when it comes to the issue, if you point out to the criticism that you're looking at, for instance, Russia is equally a superpower, and the histories that the general points to is not a history that Africa creates. In fact, very respected experts in the U.S., including people like Henry Kissinger, former advisor to Nixon, Brzezinski, former advisor to Carter, and many other academics have argued, especially Noam Chomsky, who argued and for many years that the one red line of Russia, in as far as its post-Soviet Union promises made at the time between Gorbachev and George Bush Sr., were to ensure that NATO does not expand east. That has occurred, in fact, more rapidly. And of course, post-2008, as we saw, when NATO had its conference and had agreed to have Georgia and Ukraine inducted into NATO, we immediately saw the reaction of Russia by going into Georgia. And of course, if we fast forward to 2014, when we have the coup inspired by the United States, well, this is, of course, going by WikiLeaks reports and equally reports coming directly from the United States that seem to illustrate that there was a U.S. involvement within the geopolitical nexus of Ukraine to influence the electoral outcome of the Ukrainians, and recordings that came out thereafter, of course, antagonize the Balkan situation. And equally, one would need to be a historical to not realize that it would be very difficult for one to argue that we are where we are between Russia and Ukraine as a consequence of the expansionist policies of NATO, and equally the geopolitical machinations engineered and orchestrated by the US.
Well, Farai, I'm just going to say this plainly. Those analysts who do not necessarily support this pressure say that this reaction is coming from the West because we're dealing with a country that is filled with Caucasians, more or less. And isn't this a breach of Africa's sovereignty to insist that we take a stand in a fight that's not necessarily ours? Let's set aside the fact that South Africa benefits from Russia in some way, shape, or form. Why should there be any imposition on any African country to take a stand? Because we are also still reeling from the effects of colonialism when we were more or less invaded by, the British, if we're going to use Nigeria as an example. So why should we have to take any stand just because we're being asked to?
I think it's a very good question, but also just to put a point of correction there. Russia and South Africa, in terms of trade, is actually lower than 2 billion. In fact, South Africa has generated greater trade with the United Kingdom than it would have with Russia. So, if anything, if the interest, be it economic, was the driving force in terms of the South African government's position, then of course it would have been tilted towards the West, if anything, rather than Russia itself. So that's one. But to your question, which is quite fundamental, it is important that Africa begins to assume its own positions geopolitically. You see, when we speak as a bloc or a disjointed continent, then the influence geopolitically, and we saw this with Libya when we had a temporary room to speak when Gabon and South Africa were coerced into believing that that the outcomes there would be purely based on international law, and we did not see international law play out. But no one was called a war criminal in that regard. No one took any particular responsibility for that. Iraq as well. Yemen is still ongoing. Currently, you have the war in Yemen as well. You equally have Israel and Palestinian occupation, which is a contemporary apartheid. So, as a continent that has seen the reminiscences and the impacts of colonization firsthand, one of the earliest countries, the latest countries to exit that being South Africa in 1994. But equally, looking at and currently in South Africa, the main debates that are happening, especially within Southern Africa, are focused on economic liberty. We've got civil liberties, but what of the economic liberties? And these issues are tied to a hypocritical structure that is driven by the West. So to then ask this continent that is driving its own issue of economic liberty, of building an economic equilibrium and being welcomed into the global economy, to then sort of chime into and take positions that may be against us, I think is deeply flawed. We should be able to look at this from a very cool-headed approach. I think the African approach, which is similar to China's approach, which is a much more rational, cool approach, which seeks neutrality and within the situation by virtue of not condemning, but seeking to understand the historical complexities of the region, as to advocate for solutions that are much more long-term, which is why it's important that both sides, Ukraine and Russia, are listened to, but equally the histories thereof are equally studied and understood, so that the outcomes that we then advocate for can be in the best interest of both countries and can then create long-lasting peace and avoid what all U.S. experts on this particular matter have already suggested would occur, which is a full-blown war if the expansion of NATO continues.
So, Farai, do you foresee any consequences for South Africa for not taking a stance on this issue of Russia invading Ukraine?
I don't see any consequences in this regard because I think there's quite a number of African countries that have spoken commonly with South Africa and are standing by South Africa. I think if we stand as a continent together in support of each other, then we would find very limited outcome, a limited outcome in terms of the sense of sanctions and so forth. Of course, there have been threats here and there, but these threats have been made in the corridors of diplomatic corridors, but we have not seen any outright action against South Africa. Because I think it would be any action against South Africa, as has been threatened in the past when it comes to India's position, for instance, will simply drive the agenda towards the global South. And we're already seeing that Western hegemony is actually falling apart. It's disintegrating. And I think one of the terms that I'd like to point to here is an academic term by a gentleman by the name of Paul Kennedy, who I believe was a professor at Princeton. And he coined the term imperial overreach or overstretch when an empire begins to utilize its power to a degree in which perhaps it may find its limitation and as a consequence lead to its downfall. And what we are seeing is that the BRIC nations are actually standing together, and we are seeing that the global South is beginning to want to stand up and be counted. So any actions against South Africa will simply accelerate that process and will not only be a danger to the global order as we know it, but equally advantageous for global South.
And speaking of this imperial overreach and overstretch, what do you see as the consequences that could play out? I mean, we've seen quite a few of them. If there is a long drawn-out war between Ukraine and Russia, if it lasts for more than a couple of months, what are the impacts for the African nations?
Well, of course, we'll be impacted by virtue of a number of our countries rely on Russian fertilizer, wheat as well, in terms of wheat exports and so forth. So in terms of food security within the continent, there will be an impact. So it's important, it's within our collective interest to see this issue settled. And that's why the approach from the continent is not one of condemnation, but rather of one trying to understand the complexities of the history that form these the current present outcomes. And in so doing, we can begin to take a position to advocate for a negotiated settlement or a negotiated outcome that will end the war. And so I am very much more supportive of the latter, which is that we must have a cool-headed approach, which is led by rationale and not just very condemn and they're evil, you are bad. This is not a good versus evil situation. We're not in biblical times. This is an issue that requires more nuances to be accepted and appreciated, and to figure out a collective third way.
Well, Farai, let's look at another angle in terms of Western media when it comes to, how the crises that are numerous in the continent are portrayed. Saying that Africa should take a stand regarding this Ukraine crisis can also be seen as rather condescending, because we do have crises that are ongoing right now on the continent. I mean, we've got poverty and inequality in South Africa. We've got extremism leaving millions displaced in Burkina Faso, just to mention a few. So we have our own crises going on, and from what I've seen, it's rather played down or relegated to the background. Even the steps that the Africans take in order to lift each other up during situations like this. For instance, people have opened up their homes to those who have been displaced by the crisis in Tigray, and we haven't seen that covered by Western media. So to say that we should take a stand when we're also taking a stand with the crises that are going on within the continent, isn't that to say we should relegate our own issues and uplift what's going on in the West? I'd just like your take on that.
I think this is a fantastic question as well. I think what we've seen historically is what we call the hegemonic sort of approach of narratives. So in the past, if it happens in London, if it happens in Washington, then it somehow happened to the entire world. Yet, if you look at where a majority of the world resides, it isn't in the corridors of London or in the cities of Washington. This is the actual a majority of our populations in the world, 70% or over 70% of which is in the global south. It's in between Eurasia, and then Africa, that we share quite a huge percentage of the global population. So when you talk about the global community, and not include the plight and the multiple issues that are happening within that part of the world, then it also speaks to this historical hangover of empire, which is tied to our to our coloniality. So when they speak in the manner that they speak in the present, when the West speaks in the manner that it speaks, especially to our continent, it forgets that within our continent we already have issues that are plaguing us, but they are not portrayed with the same significance and importance as is the case perhaps in Ukraine. Now, one may understand that Ukraine has a crisis, as it does, but so does Syria, so does Afghanistan, so is Ethiopia in the Tigrayan region, for example, so is Mozambique, and so forth. So the question of us being seen as human, this is a critical aspect. The question of us being seen as human through the lens of Eurocentric, or rather global North media machinery, is still an issue that we advocate for now. And unfortunately, the only way that we can begin to humanize the story of the African is through Africans owning and controlling their own media, so as to ensure that our own stories are being told. This is something that, of course, the global North, in the context of the West, would not be able to appreciate. But their history is tied to a one in which the story of the African is seen through the narrative of slavery and Martin Luther King, which I'm sure if Martin Luther King was to be alive, he he would feel sorrowful as one to be summed up as the sum total of African and the Black experience in terms of the contribution towards human history is concerned.
Well, Farah, like you noted, there are lots of wars going on. The war in Yemen is one, the war in Syria is one. And then I also recall that the United States, invaded Iraq. The United States also invaded Afghanistan. We've seen how that turned out. And in those situations, Africa was not asked to take a stance. So what is the strategic importance of this Russia-Ukraine war? Why does Africa need to take a stance? Why is the West insisting that Africa should take a stance on this particular war? What's the importance? What's the significance? Briefly.
Well, I think with this issue, I think for the first time, the West actually has to counter militarily, that is, countenance militarily, a power that is equal. In the past, they have occupied countries that have no military might that's comparable to their own. Well, but yet, of course, going into Afghanistan, fighting people who are sitting on donkeys, but yet losing that war eventually after 17 years. But in this particular instance, they're facing another superpower, another power who can equally respond militarily, can equally respond economically. That is, by, as you can see currently, the prices of oil and food within these very same markets that have sanctioned Russia are being impacted by the very same decisions that they've made. And to garner support is the only is as a way of sort of a psyops or a PR exercise to ensure that there's a balance and of attack, so as to justify perhaps whatever action they then take, because they would be impacted within their own voting populations. America will go to an election, and at the end of the day, what the voter would look at is the price of oil and food. They will not care about the Russian crisis. So it's important that they factor in these things when it comes to facing a challenge such as Russia. And remember, the military might of Russia, or the military might of America, at that, has not been tested on an equal footing with a power such as Russia as well. So these are very scary times, and the approach thereof should be very cool. And Africa has an opportunity to play a very neutral role and one that is productive and actually recenter and rebalance the world as we'd like to see it.
Well, great conversation. Thank you so much for joining the program this afternoon, Farai Muvuti.